I don't know who this is for today, but I need you to hear me. God is about to shift everything in your life. I'm talking about the kind of shift that breaks chains, that moves mountains, that turns pain into purpose. You've been praying, you've been waiting, you've been wondering, God, when is it my time? And I came to tell you, your time is now. See, sometimes God has to shake things up before he sets things right. That delay, it wasn't denial. That closed door, it was preparation. That setback, it was the setup for your comeback. And if you're ready, if you're really ready, God is about to release a breakthrough that will leave you standing there saying, only God could have done this. When God is getting ready to shift everything in your life, the first thing he requires is your surrender. Surrender is not just about lifting your hands in worship or saying a quick prayer. It is about fully releasing your grip on your plans, your timeline, your expectations, and even your fears. It is about trusting that God's way is higher than your way, even when it doesn't make sense. It is about stepping into obedience, even when you don't see the full picture. Many people want the breakthrough, but they are unwilling to let go of what is familiar. They want the shift, but they don't want to release control. And that is where the struggle begins. Because when God is about to do something new in your life, he will often ask you to let go of something old. That could be a mindset, a relationship, a habit, a job, or even a dream that no longer aligns with where he is taking you. But the longer you hold on to what God is asking you to release, the longer you delay the shift that he wants to bring. Think about Abraham. God told him to leave his country, his people, and his father's household and go to a land that he would show him. God didn't even tell him where he was going. He just said, go. That is what surrender looks like. It's moving in faith when you don't have all the answers. It's trusting that God's provision will meet you in the place he is calling you to. But if Abraham had refused to leave his homeland, he would have never stepped into the promise that God had for him. Surrender is an act of faith. It says, God, I trust you even when I don't understand. It says, God, I will follow you even when the path isn't clear. It says, God, I believe that what you have for me is better than what I am holding on to. But the challenge is that surrender often feels like loss before it feels like gain. It feels like sacrifice before it feels like blessing. It feels like discomfort before it feels like breakthrough. And that is where many people give up. They start the process, but when it gets hard, when it feels uncertain, when God starts stripping away things they thought they needed, they start pulling back. The Israelites struggled with surrender when God brought them out of Egypt. They prayed for freedom. They cried out for deliverance. And when God finally brought them out, they still longed for what was familiar. The wilderness was uncomfortable. It was uncertain. And instead of fully trusting that God was leading them to the promised land, they kept looking back to the place of their bondage. How many times do we do the same thing? We pray for God to shift things in our lives, but when he starts moving, we resist because it doesn't look the way we expected. Surrender requires you to release the illusion of control. You were never in control to begin with. That is the hard truth. You can plan, you can strategize, you can set goals, but at the end of the day, only God holds the blueprint of your life. And sometimes he will disrupt your plans to align you with his purpose. He will close doors you thought should be open. He will reroute your steps. He will allow certain things to fall apart so that the right things can come together. And in those moments, you have a choice to fight against the shift or to surrender to it. Jesus modeled surrender in the greatest way possible. In the Garden of Gethsemane, when he was about to endure the cross, he prayed, Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. but not my will, yours be done. That is surrender. That is choosing God's will over personal comfort. That is trusting that even when it hurts, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't make sense, God's plan is greater. Many times we pray, God use me, God bless me, God elevate me. But when he starts positioning us for that next level, when he starts stretching us, when he starts pruning us, we resist because it feels uncomfortable. But what if the very thing that feels like a loss is actually positioning you for something greater? What if the thing God is asking you to release is the very thing standing in the way of your breakthrough? What if the shift you've been praying for requires you to first surrender everything that is not in alignment with where he is taking you? When God called Peter to walk on water, Peter had to surrender his fear. He had to surrender his logic. He had to surrender everything in him that said, this is impossible. And the moment he stepped out, he did what had never been done before. But the moment he took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the waves, he began to sink. That is what happens when we try to take back control. We start doubting, we start sinking, we start questioning if God is really going to come through. But surrender says, I will keep my eyes on you, God, no matter what is happening around me. Some of the greatest miracles in your life will be on the other side of surrender. But the question is, are you willing to trust God even when you don't have all the answers? Are you willing to follow his voice even when it doesn't make sense? Are you willing to let go of what is comfortable so that you can step into what is greater? When you are in a season of waiting, it can feel like nothing is happening. You pray, you believe, you expect, but it seems like God is silent. The temptation in these moments is to assume that God has forgotten about you or that your prayers have gone unheard. But what if the delay is not a denial? What if the very thing that seems like a setback is actually a divine setup? What if God is working behind the scenes in ways you cannot see, preparing you for something greater than what you even imagine? God is never in a rush. He is not bound by human timelines. While you may feel like you should already be walking in your breakthrough, God knows exactly when the right time is. And often the waiting period is where the real work happens. It is where God develops you, strengthens you, and positions you for what is coming. The delay is not meant to break you, because if you step into something too soon, before you are ready, what was meant to bless you could end up overwhelming you. Think about Joseph. God gave him a dream at a young age that he would be a ruler, but instead of stepping into that position immediately, he went through years of testing. He was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. From the outside looking in, it seemed like his life was going backward instead of forward. But every step of that journey was necessary. God was not just preparing the palace for Joseph, he was preparing Joseph for the palace. There were lessons he had to learn, character he had to develop, and faith he had to strengthen before he could handle the position that God had for him. Many times we assume that just because we are gifted, we are ready. Just because we have a calling, we are prepared. But God sees beyond what we see. He knows the weight of the blessing he is about to release, and he will not allow you to step into something that you are not yet equipped to handle. That is why the waiting season is necessary. It is not punishment, it is preparation. God is refining you, stretching you, teaching you endurance, and molding you into the person who can handle the next level. David was anointed as king long before he actually took the throne. But between the anointing and the appointing, there was a process. He went back to tending sheep. He faced Goliath. He served under King Saul, who later tried to kill him. He hid in caves. He waited for years. And through all of that, God was shaping him into the leader that Israel needed. If David had taken the throne prematurely, he would not have had the wisdom, patience, and reliance on God that he gained through those years of waiting. The waiting period can feel frustrating because you are aware of the promise, but you have not yet seen it manifest. This is where many people give up. They assume that because it has not happened yet, it never will. But timing is everything with God. And while you are waiting, He is working. He is aligning the right people, creating the right opportunities, and ensuring that when He finally opens the door, you are able to walk through it with confidence and authority. The challenge is that waiting requires trust. It requires faith in God's timing, even when your emotions are telling you otherwise. It requires patience when everything in you wants to move faster. It requires surrendering your own plans and saying, God, I trust you, even when I don't understand. The enemy will try to use the waiting season to plant doubt, fear, and frustration in your mind. He will try to convince you that God has abandoned you, that you are stuck, that nothing is changing. But just because you cannot see what God is doing does not mean He is not working. Some of the most powerful breakthroughs happen suddenly. One moment everything seems the same, and the next God shifts everything in an instant. But sudden breakthroughs are usually preceded by long seasons of preparation. It may feel like nothing is happening, but in reality, everything is happening beneath the surface. The roots of a tree grow deep before the fruit ever appears. The foundation of a building is laid before anyone sees the structure rise. The most important work happens in the hidden place before it is ever revealed publicly. God is not just concerned with giving you the blessing. He is concerned with making sure you can sustain it. That is why the process is necessary. He is stretching your faith, increasing your capacity, and teaching you how to handle the weight of the very thing you are praying for. When the time is right, what took years to prepare will manifest in a moment. The delay was never a denial. It was a divine setup for something far greater than you imagined. When you are on the verge of a breakthrough, the pressure intensifies. The challenges seem heavier, the obstacles appear bigger, and the attacks feel relentless. It is in these moments that many people begin to question whether they heard God correctly, whether they are really meant to step into what He has promised, or whether they even have the strength to keep going. But what they do not realize is that the intensity of the battle is often a sign that the breakthrough is near. The breaking point is not the end, it is the place where everything shifts. It is the moment where God moves in a way that only He can. When a woman is in labor, the pain reaches its peak right before the birth. The contractions become stronger, closer together, and more unbearable. In that moment, it would be easy to give up, to believe that the pain is too much, that the process is too overwhelming. But that pain is actually proof that something new is about to be birthed. It is an indication that what was hidden is about to be revealed. This is what happens spiritually when you are at the edge of a breakthrough. The pressure increases. The trials seem unbearable, and everything in you wants to quit. But if you can hold on, if you can push through the pain, you will step into the very thing God has been preparing for you. Before every major move of God in a person's life, there is always a moment of testing. Look at Job. He was a man who loved God, who lived righteously, and yet he lost everything in what felt like an instant. His wealth, his children, his health, it all seemed to crumble at once. The enemy thought he could break Job, that he could get him to turn away from God. But what the enemy did not realize was that Job's breaking point was actually the setup for his breakthrough. through because he held on, because he refused to curse God, because he remained faithful even when everything in his life told him to give up. God restored him with double of what he lost. The breaking point feels like the place where you cannot go any further, where the burden is too heavy to carry. It is the moment where your strength runs out, and that is exactly where God steps in. Because breakthroughs are not achieved in your own strength. They happen when you come to the end of yourself and lean completely on God. When you stop trying to figure it out on your own. When you stop relying on your own ability. When you surrender completely and say, God, I can't do this without you. That is when the shift happens. Think about the Israelites when they were fleeing Egypt. They had just been delivered from years of slavery, and now they found themselves trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army. In the natural, there was no way out. The situation looked impossible. Fear set in, and many of them started to question whether they should have even left Egypt in the first place. But what they saw as an impossible situation was actually a setup for God to reveal his power. At the breaking point, when there was nowhere else to turn, God split the sea and made a way where there was no way. If they had given up in that moment of fear, they would have missed their break. So many people stop right before the breakthrough because they mistake the breaking point for the end instead of recognizing it as the transition. They allow the pressure to convince them that they are not strong enough to keep going, that maybe it is not meant to be, that maybe they misheard God. But the truth is, when the battle intensifies, it is often a sign that the enemy is panicking. He knows that if you keep pushing, if you keep believing, if you keep standing on God's promises, you will step into something that he cannot stop. He knows that your breakthrough will not only change your life, but will also impact others around you. And so he throws everything he can at you in that final moment, hoping that you will break before you reach it. In the Bible, Paul and Silas were thrown into prison for preaching the gospel. They were beaten, chained, and locked in the deepest part of the prison. In the natural, it looked like their ministry was over, but instead of complaining, instead of giving in to despair, they began to praise God. They worshiped in the middle of their breaking point. And as they praised, the prison shook, the chains fell off, and the doors swung open. Their breakthrough came not when the circumstances changed, but when they chose to praise God in the middle of their pain. What if the very thing keeping you bound is waiting for your response? What if the breakthrough is already set in motion, but God is waiting for you to trust him even when you do not see it? The difference between those who step into their breakthrough and those who miss it is what they do at the breaking point. Do they allow the pressure to make them quit? Or do they press in even harder? Do they let the fear consume them? Or do they hold on to faith? Do they retreat? Or do they stand firm on God's promises? Because the enemy wants you to believe that the pain is for nothing, that the struggle is meaningless. But God is saying, hold on, keep pushing. The very thing you have been waiting for is on the other side of this. When God is shifting you to a new level, one of the first things he requires is a shift in your mindset. You cannot step into a new season with an old way of thinking. You cannot embrace what God has for you while still holding on to the doubts, fears, and limitations that have kept you stuck. The way you think determines the way you live. And if you want to walk in the fullness of what God has prepared for you, you have to renew your mind and align your thoughts with his truth. Many people pray for a breakthrough, but their minds are still conditioned for struggle. They ask for blessings, but deep down they do not believe they are worthy of them. They desire elevation, but they are still bound by the mentality of lack, insecurity, and fear. God can open a door, but if your mind is not prepared to walk through it, you will hesitate, doubt yourself, or even sabotage the very thing you prayed for. That is why the transformation always begins in the mind before it manifests in your life. The Bible says in Romans 12:02, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Transformation is not about external changes first, it starts on the inside. It is about shifting from a mindset of fear to faith, from limitation to possibility, from doubt to confidence in God's promises. The enemy knows that if he can keep you thinking small, he can keep you living small. If he can plant seeds of fear, insecurity, and unworthiness in your mind, he can keep you from ever stepping into the destiny God has for you. Look at the Israelites when they were delivered from Egypt. They were physically free, but mentally they were still slaves. God had promised them a land flowing with milk and honey, but they struggled to believe it. When Moses sent out the 12 spies to scout the land, 10 of them came back with a negative report. They said the land was good, but the giants were too big, the obstacles were too strong, and they saw themselves as grasshoppers in comparison. It was not the giants that kept them out of the promised land, it was their mindset. They had been set free from Egypt, but Egypt was still in their minds. Instead of focusing on God's power, they focused on their limitations, and because of that, an entire generation missed out on what God had prepared for them. When you are stepping into something new, you have to start seeing yourself the way God sees you. You are not small. You are not weak. You are not incapable. You are a child of God, equipped with everything you need to step into your purpose. But if you keep telling yourself that you are not good enough, that you are not smart enough, that you do not have what it takes, you will disqualify yourself from blessings that were already meant for you. Your words and thoughts carry power, and the way you think will shape the reality you walk in. Gideon struggled with this when God called him to be a mighty warrior. When the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior," Gideon did not believe it. He was hiding, afraid, and full of doubt. He started listing all the reasons why he was the least qualified, why he was not strong enough, why his background did not match the calling. But God did not call him based on how he saw himself. God called him based on who he created him to be. And once Gideon shifted his mindset and aligned with what God said about him, he stepped into victory. God is trying to do something new in your life, but if you keep holding onto the same fears, the same excuses, and the same limited way of thinking, you will keep running into the same obstacles. A new level requires a new mindset. You have to stop seeing yourself through the lens of your past and start seeing yourself through the lens of God's promise. You have to stop focusing on what you lack and start focusing on what God has placed inside of you. You have to stop waiting for everything to be perfect before you take action and start trusting that God has already equipped you for the next step. Your mind is either going to be your greatest asset or your biggest obstacle. You have to start thinking in alignment with what God has spoken over your life. If he has called you to something greater, then you have to start believing that greater is possible. If he has told you that you are chosen, then you have to stop seeing yourself as unworthy. If he has promised to make a way, then you have to stop dwelling on the obstacle. The battle is won or lost in the mind first, and if you can shift your thinking, you can shift your entire life. Every person God used mightily had to go through a mental shift before they stepped into their calling. Joseph had to see himself as a leader before he ever wore a crown. David had to believe he could defeat Goliath before he ever picked up the stone. Esther had to see herself as more than just an orphan before she could walk into her destiny as queen. The external victory always follows the internal transformation. If you can change the way you think, you can change the way you live. If you can renew your mind, you can step into everything God has for you. When God is preparing you for a shift, one of the first things He does is separate you from certain people, places, and habits that can no longer go with you. It is one of the most difficult parts of stepping into a new season because separation feels like loss. It feels like rejection, isolation, or even punishment. But what if the very thing you see as a loss is actually protection? What if God is not taking something from you, but making room for something greater? What if the people who walked away, the doors that closed, and the things that no longer feel right are actually signs that God is positioning you for something better? So many people miss their breakthrough because they refuse to let go of what God is trying to remove. They cling to relationships that have expired, hold on to mindsets that no longer serve them, and try to force themselves into spaces that they have outgrown. But when God is shifting you, He will make you uncomfortable in places where you were once comfortable. He will stir something inside of you that says, there is more. He will remove the crutches you have leaned on so that you learn to fully depend on Him. Because if you are too attached to where you have been, you will never step into where He is trying to take you. Abraham had to leave his homeland before he could step into God's promise. God told him to go to a place that He would show him, but He did not give him all the details up front. He did not tell him exactly where he was going, how long the journey would take, or what challenges he would face along the way. He simply said, go. And Abraham had a choice. He could stay in what was familiar, what was comfortable, what was safe, or he could trust God and move forward. The same is true for you. Sometimes God will call you to leave behind what you have known without giving you the full picture of what is ahead. That is where faith comes in. That is where trust is built. Because if you can only move when you have all the answers, you are not walking by faith, you are walking by sight. When God is calling you higher, there will be people who do not understand it. There will be relationships that start to feel strained. There will be connections that suddenly fade. And if you are not careful, you will mistake divine separation for rejection. You will try to hold on to people that God is removing, thinking that something is wrong, when in reality, He is protecting you from relationships that would hinder your growth. Not everyone is meant to go with you to the next level. Some people were assigned to your past, but they cannot handle where God is taking you. If you try to bring them along, they will only slow you down, distract you, or pull you back into old patterns. Lot was not supposed to go with Abraham when he set out on his journey, but Abraham took him anyway. And for a while, things seemed fine, but eventually strife broke out between them. Their herdsmen started arguing. Their possessions became too much to share the same space, and conflict arose. Abraham had to make a choice. Continue trying to make something work that was no longer aligned with God's plan, or separate and trust that God knew what He was doing. The moment they parted ways, God gave Abraham fresh revelation. He told him to look around, that everything he saw would be given to him. It was as if God was waiting for Abraham to let go of the unnecessary weight before he could fully release the next level of blessing. Many people stay stuck because they refuse to release what God has told them to let go of. They hold on to toxic relationships out of fear of being alone. They stay in jobs that drain them because they are afraid of uncertainty. They keep entertaining old habits, old mindsets, and old ways of living because they do not fully trust that God has something better. but you cannot receive the new thing God has for you if your hands are still full of the old. You cannot walk into a new season while dragging the baggage of the past. At some point, you have to trust that if God is asking you to let go, it is because He has something greater in store. Even Jesus experienced separation before stepping fully into His purpose. Before He began His ministry, He was led into the wilderness alone. Before He performed miracles, He spent time in isolation, fasting and praying. And even as He walked in His calling, not everyone could go with Him to certain places. He had 12 disciples, but there were moments when He only took Peter, James, and John. He loved them all, but not everyone could handle the same level of revelation. Not everyone could witness what was happening behind the scenes. And the same is true for you. There are some things God is doing in your life that not everyone can be part of. The people who walked away, the friendships that faded, the opportunities that seemed to slip through your fingers, none of it was an accident. God is intentional. He knows what you need for where you are going, and He knows what will only slow you down. Instead of mourning what was lost, trust that He is making room for what is coming. Instead of trying to force what no longer fits, surrender to the shift. If God is removing something, it is because it is no longer aligned with your destiny. If He is creating distance, it is because He is protecting you. And if He is calling you to walk away from something, it is because He has something greater waiting for you ahead. When God is about to shift everything in your life, one of the first things He does is test your faith. Not because He wants to see you struggle, but because He wants to strengthen your ability to trust Him completely. Faith is not just believing when things are easy. It is holding on when everything around you suggests otherwise. It is standing firm when you cannot see how things will work out. It is choosing to believe in the unseen promises of God even when your current reality looks nothing like what He has spoken over your life. Faith is the foundation of every breakthrough, and before God shifts you, He will require you to step out in faith in a way you never have before. Abraham is a perfect example of this. God told him to leave his home and go to a land that He would show him. He did not give Abraham all the details. He did not tell him exactly where he was going or how long it would take to get there. He simply said, "Go." And Abraham had a choice. He could stay in the comfort of what was familiar, or he could trust God enough to step into the unknown. That is what faith looks like. It is walking forward even when you do not have all the answers. It is obeying God when logic tells you to wait until you have more certainty. But if you are waiting for everything to make sense before you move, you will never step into what God has for you, because the biggest blessings are always on the other side of faith. Peter experienced this when he stepped out of the boat. The storm was raging, the waves were crashing, and Jesus called him to come. In that moment, Peter had a decision to make. He could stay where it was safe, where everything was predictable, where he was in control, or he could step out in faith, not knowing if the water would hold him. And for a moment, as long as his eyes were on Jesus, he walked on water. But the moment he focused on the wind, the moment he let fear creep in, he started to sink. That is what happens when you allow doubt to take your eyes off God. The moment you start focusing on the obstacles instead of the one who called you, you begin to lose your footing. But even when Peter began to sink, Jesus was right there to lift him up. Because faith does not mean you will never struggle. It means that even when you stumble, God will not let you fall. Faith is what allows you to move even when you do not have all the resources. It is what allows you to take the first step when you do not know where the second one will be. It is what keeps you going when the odds are against you. The enemy wants you to think that because you cannot see the whole picture, you should stay where you are. He wants you to believe that if you do not have every detail figured out, you are not ready. But God is saying, move now, step now, trust now. Because if you wait until you feel completely ready, you will never take action. Faith is not about waiting until everything is perfect. It is about trusting that God will make a way as you move forward. Look at Joshua and the Israelites when they were crossing the Jordan River. God told them to step into the water before it parted. He did not split the water ahead of time. He did not clear the path first. He required them to step in while the river was still flowing, while the current was still strong. It was not until their feet touched the water that the miracle happened. That is how faith works. You will not always see the provision before you step out. You will not always have confirmation before you move forward. But when you take that step, when you trust that God will meet you there, that is when you see His power in ways you never have before. Faith is also about persistence. It is not just about believing once. It is about continuing to believe even when it takes longer than expected. So many people give up on what God promised them because it does not happen as quickly as they thought it would. They pray for a shift, but when they do not see immediate results, they start doubting. They start questioning whether God really spoke, whether they really heard correctly, whether they should just settle where they are. But real faith does not quit. It does not back down at the first sign of resistance. It keeps pressing forward even when nothing seems to be changing, because sometimes God is not just testing your faith in the moment, He is testing your endurance. He wants to know if you will keep believing, keep moving, keep trusting, even when the process takes longer than expected. The woman with the issue of blood had to push through the crowd to get to Jesus. She had been suffering for 12 years. She had tried everything. She had been disappointed over and over again, but she did not let that stop her. She did not let past failures keep her from believing that this time would be different. She kept pressing forward, reaching for Jesus, believing that if she could just touch Him, she would be healed. And because of her faith, she received her breakthrough. What if she had given up? What if she had let doubt keep her from pressing through? She would have missed what God had for her. And that is exactly where many people get stuck. They stop pressing, stop believing, stop moving forward. Right before the breakthrough happens, God is looking for people who will trust Him no matter what, people who will step out even when it does not make sense, people who will keep going even when the process is hard, because if you can trust Him in the unknown, He will take you places you never imagined. If you can believe even when it looks impossible, He will show you His power in ways you have never seen before. The shift is coming, but it will require faith. The breakthrough is near, but it will require movement. God is ready to do His part. He is just waiting for you to do yours.